the architecture. So let's all watch as the curtain rises here. Here we go, folks. This is it. This is Chicago, the reason that you're here today. We've got a lot to talk about with this architecture here today. Take it all in. We're going to get started right away. We've got a new addition to our skyline right here on the right. This is the St. Regis, kind of a wibbly wobbly blue building you see right here. St. Regis, designed by superstar architect Jeannie Gang. Jeannie Gang, born and raised right around here in Chicago, Chicagoland area. Went to Harvard, won the MacArthur Genius Grant, certified genius, Jeannie Gang. This is the third tallest building here in Chicago, but it's actually the tallest building in the world, designed by a female-led architectural firm. So very proud of that, changing face of architecture right here in Chicago. We've got so much to talk about with the St. Regis. We're going to talk about it more later. We can't even get to it all right now. We're going to leave it as a little bit of a cliffhanger. I don't know if you know this or not, but we dropped you off where we picked you up, so we'll be coming back around here. When we do, we'll finish up talking about the St. Regis. You know, on our tour here today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a lot about architecture, and so we're going to start learning some different styles of architecture, different vocabulary to use to talk about architecture. We're going to do that right now. We're going to start looking really at the buildings around us. A good one to start with is the building straight ahead. Take a look straight ahead of us here and take a look at this building and start to piece together what can you figure out just from looking at the building. First of all, you probably figure out the name of it. It's got its name tag on it, Trump International Hotel and Tower. But what else do you see? You see a lot of reflective glass on the surface of the building. That gives you a clue that's probably a more recently built building. Sure enough, built in 2009. I want to point out up at the top, you see that sort of stick up there? That's a spire. So that's included in the height of the building. Turns out that spire helps make that the second tallest building in Chicago. So that spire is included in the height. What else do you see? A bunch of curved sides on the building, right? Also, you see these patios. See these patios up the sides of the building? Another name for those patios are setbacks. You'll hear me saying that term over and over again. Setbacks, these little patios that go up the side of the building. Well, these patios are at the heights of some of the other buildings around it. For example, where it says Trump, that first patio is at the height of the sort of wedding cake of a building over here to the right. See, this style of architecture is trying to look good in context, in the space that it's in. So the name of that style of architecture is called Contextualism. Contextualism, that's a style of architecture we're going to be talking more about as we continue on our tour. Now another thing we get to talk about today is we've got Andre the Bubble Guy. This is just a local resident of Chicago, comes on out and spreads some joy for all of us here on the river. We're glad to have him. We don't get that every tour. That's the first tour today we've had with Andre, so everybody say hi to Andre. But as we come out from, yeah, there you go. It's a cold day for Andre up there, you know. He didn't even pay for a tour. As we come out from under the bridge, let's do a little comparing and contrasting. So 2009, Trump International Hotel and Tower. Let's look at this white building here on the right. Taking a look at it, what do you already know? You can probably guess that's an older building. How do you know that? Well, the material, right? Take a look at the surface covered with, these are terracotta tiles that are all on the surface of this building. This building, you can see all the decorative elements, a little bit shorter clock tower on it, all tells you that it's an older building. You'd be right, it's 100 years old, built in 1921. That's the Wrigley Building. You might have heard that name around town, right? Wrigley Field. Wrigley Chewing Gum, that's all bubble gum money that you're looking at right there. And this building's trying to look like a Spanish cathedral. Begs the question, why are they building buildings that look like Spanish cathedrals in Chicago in the 1920s? Well, turns out we don't have our own style of architecture early on in the history of the city, so we're just borrowing styles from Europe. We call that Spanish revival style. A lot of times when we're borrowing these cathedral styles from Europe, we call those revival style. That's another another style of architecture we're going to talk about a lot on our tour. Now, The other thing I want you to keep in mind is when this building was built 100 years ago, this was the tallest building in Chicago. It was the first office building built this side of the river. As we continue through our tour today, I want you to imagine what the city must have been like at different times. Imagine Chicago where this is the cutting edge, new, tallest building in the city. That's a very different Chicago than the one in 2009 or even today, right? So keep that in mind as we continue along. To keep that in mind, remember when I told you about that log cabin and that fort that were here over 200 years ago? This is where they were. DeSable's log cabin was over here. Fort Dearborn was right there. I told you it was at the mouth of the river. Well, the lake's over there. What's going on? Turns out, 200 years ago, the lake came all the way up to here. This is all landfill. Everything we've passed so far, we've built up over time. So again, imagine a Chicago where all there was the lake, the river, and a log cabin and a fort, right? Keeps changing the way the city looks through time. As we get closer to Trump International Hotel and Tower, I want to talk about the architect. Adrian Smith is the name of the architect, another superstar architect, born and raised right here in Chicago. Sometimes they call Adrian Smith the world's tallest architect, not because of his height, but because he's also designed the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. If you want to get a sense of how tall that is, take 2 Trump towers, stack them on top of each other. That's how tall the Burj Khalifa is. Now, we don't have the tallest building in the world anymore here in Chicago, but we are responsible for raising the architects that go off and design them. So we're still proud of that. As we come around the corner, another very nice revival style building here on the left. You see this one with the tower in the center and little posts all along the edges. This is called the Jewelers Building. In the 1920s, this is where all the jewelers in Chicago worked out of. And when you know those different styles, you can start placing the time, right? The Wrigley Building, early 1920s. Jewelers Building, that revival style, early 1920s. Now, what's going on in Chicago at that time? A lot of tough guys walking around on the streets, right? Prohibition era, a bunch of gangsters here, kind of a tough town. So the Jewelers Building had a elevator for cars. The idea being you don't want to unload your precious jewels on the street. You drive into the building, take the elevator up and unload it right inside, right? Nobody's sticking you up on the street. As we come around the corner here, we're going to jump again in time. 2 iconic towers here in Chicago. Looks like big corncob buildings. This is Marina City from the 1960s now. Now, Bertrand Goldberg is the name of the architect responsible for these buildings. And back in the 1960s, not a lot of people lived downtown. You'd come to work and go live in the suburbs afterwards, right? Well, Bertrand was a social scientist, wanted to change all that. He built Marina City as a city within the city. Apartments up above, valet parking down below, and in the building there's stores, restaurants, fitness center, ice skating rink, bowling alley. Used to have a movie theater in there. It's now the House of Blues, right? An introvert's dream. You can live your whole life without heading out of your pajamas, living in the Marina City here, right? But it worked. It changed the way that people live. A lot of people live in urban centers today in multi-use buildings. It was architects like Bertrand Goldberg that changed that changed the way that people live. They call it Marina City because it's got a place to park your yacht, which was definitely very surprising in the 1960s because back then this river was, to put it bluntly, a dump, very polluted waterway, not something you want to spend a lot of time on. But architects knew that this would change over time, and sure enough, in the early 2000s, you can see we started on our Riverwalk. We've added about a mile of new shoreline here to Chicago on the left. This is a great example of a positive loop. As more folks come down to the river, the more interested they are in keeping the river clean. And as the river gets cleaner and cleaner, the more people come down and visit it. Guess what? That's all of you guys. You're here because this river's clean as well. We're going to talk more about the Riverwalk and more about positive loops a little bit later. As we pass under the bridge, we're going to take another look at another style of architecture. Take a look at this building here on the left. A lot of reflective glass on the surface, which gives you a hint that it's more recently built. Sure enough, in the 1990s, this building was built, so at least within my lifetime. You take a look up at the top, you see that triangular shape up on top, reminiscent of a Roman or Grecian temple. The name of this style of architecture is called neoclassic architecture. New, but in that classical style, like ancient Greece and Rome. But I want you to look at the reflective glass on the surface. You'll see how the neighbors across the way appear to sail across the front of the building. You'll also see the weather conditions, the time of day reflected on the surface of the building. That's why architects love this reflective glass so much, is because every time you look at the building, it's going to look different because of that reflective glass. It's going to capture the environmental envelope of the space around it. Now, as we pass under the bridge here, the next building we're going to talk about is a great example of how we respect our architectural heritage here in Chicago. It's a building that stands between two different decades. I want you to look at the Builders Building here on the left, this big tan building. Now you'll see there's a break about 3/4 of the way down the building. That's because this section on the left was built in the 1920s. But the roof and the annex to the right were added in the 80s. Now you'll see the section from the 80s doesn't exactly copy what came before, but they're inspired by the older building, and they build with modern materials and in a modern technique. So as we pass under the bridge, take a closer look at some of the details, the ways in which the two parts of the building are the same but also different. As we look at this building that stands between two decades, the 1920s and the 1980s. Once you're done taking a look at the details here, we're going to cut across the river to this building that's still catching a little bit of light. This is a style of architecture we're going to talk about a lot on our tour today. Let's take a look first at some of the details. Soaring vertical lines on the front of the buildings. You see those? The windows kind of making these soaring vertical lines. And a bunch of setbacks. Remember those setbacks we talked about with the Trump Tower? Little setbacks up at the top that draw your eyes upward. Very optimistic style of architecture. It's also supposed to be a futuristic style of architecture. It's from the roaring 20s, late 20s into the early 30s. It's called Art Deco. And it's really interesting because it's a 100-year-old version of what they thought the future would look like today, this Art Deco style. Now this building is the Merchandise Mart. It was built for all of the merchants in Chicago to come and shop for goods for their stores. And so what they've done is they have these pedestals out in front with busts of all the famous merchants of Chicago from the 1930s. Names you might be familiar with. Marshall Fields, Montgomery Ward's up there. And what's kind of fun is if you climb up one of these pedestals and push the head back, a big hunk of candy comes out of the neck. So that's a Pez joke. So the Merchandise Mart here, 2 full city blocks. Huge building, 25 stories tall. If you took all of the office space inside of it and laid it out, over 70 football fields of office space. The building's so big, when it first opened up, it had its own zip code. That's a lot of building. And again, from that Prohibition era here in Chicago, kind of looks like 2 big shoulders in a pinstripe suit when you look at it. Now, as we pass under this bridge, this is one of the most breathtaking parts of the river. Make sure you get your cameras out, get your eyes up as we head into Wolf Point. 360 degrees of architecture. The majority of the buildings you see here built in the last 6 years. Wolf Point is the name of the part of the river where the south and north branches meet the main branch here. And oh, you guys are in luck. You got the train line coming through. That's the shot you want. Get those cameras out for that. Now, where all those points of the river meet, there's a building. They call it River Point. Makes sense, right? We have a nickname for it, though. The parabolic arches on the top and bottom kind of make it look like a box that you cook your Hot Pocket in, so they call it the Hot Pocket building right here. But you know, there's a reason for that. That arch on the base is to set back the supports at the front of the building. There's a train line that cuts underneath. Those circles that you see are exhaust fans for the train. And that continues on to this next building, 150 North Riverside, that's getting to be right in front of us here. It goes behind, the train goes behind the building, so there's a setback at the base. The city mandates a 30-foot setback from the river. So if you take a look at this building, the base of it looks like a pencil on its point. Can be a little concerning. 39-foot wide base on this building. That's fairly tall, right? Nothing to worry about. Very structurally strong buildings. But we are going to talk about 3 techniques that architects use for building these really tall buildings here in the Wrigley City. Now, one thing you need to know about these really tall buildings is they're built to sway. They will sway a number of inches in both directions in the wind. That's on purpose. pressure that way. You'd rather your building sway than crack, right? But if you're in the building, you want it to come back to center very quickly, right? So the way that they do that is inside this building. This is the first technique for building really tall buildings in the Windy City. Inside this building, way up at the top, you can't see it, but inside of there's hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. And so when the building sways, watch me, all the water sloshes and it pulls the building back towards center. If it overcompensates, it sloshes again pulling the building back towards center. It's called inertial slosh dampeners. That's the first of 3 techniques we're going to talk about for building really tall buildings here in the Windy City. Inertial slosh dampeners. Did you write this down? We're going to talk about it later. Okay, you're fine. You're doing great. As we pass under this bridge, another addition to our Skyline 2020 Bank of America building, a different solution to the mandated 30-foot setback from the river, tripods holding up the base of the building. Another example of respecting our architectural heritage. The building that was here before this one from the 1950s had metal panels on the surface. When they tore it down, they saved those panels. Take a look at your eye line. You see these wavy silver panels on the building? Those are decorative details. Those are from the older building, a tip of the hat of the history of this space to remember what had come before. Now, talking about the history of architecture on the river, the next section of the river we're headed into is called our architectural time machine. 5 buildings on the right that are all built in chronological order. We're going to decode them one by one. Now, I want you to keep in mind, one of the earliest styles we talked about were those cathedral kind of revival styles. Remember that from the Wrigley Building? That was the earliest style, early 1920s. Gave way to the Roaring 20s with soaring vertical lines, setbacks up at the top of the building. Remember that Art Deco style we saw with the Merchandise Mart? Here it is again, right? Now what happens in the 30s in the US? Well, you've got the Great Depression. You've got the stock market crash, followed by World War II. Not a lot of buildings being built during the 30s and 40s. It's not until the late 50s that we have a reboot in architecture. Take a look at these next 2 buildings from the late 50s, early 60s. 2 words probably come to mind: black boxes, right? That's the name of this style of architecture, black box modernism. A man most closely associated with this style of architecture named Mies van der Rohe, arguably the most influential architect of the 20th century, had his offices right here in Chicago, famous for saying less is more, believed form follows function. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at the building. What's the function of an office building? It's a box that holds offices. That's the design, right? What are we going to make it out of? Metal and glass. That's what you see on the surface. We're not covering anything up with decorative details or other elements. Less is more. The beauty of this building comes from its simplicity. You can see the honesty of the building materials. You can see the precision of the lines and the angles, right? This is a very elegant style of architecture. It's basically the architectural equivalent of a black suit and tie. Now, as time changes, tastes change, and architecture changes along with it. We go from the 60s into the 70s, and not much has changed really. We've gone from black boxes into white boxes. This is the international style of architecture, 1970s. Surface of the building now covered with stone or concrete. This is the type of building you could put anywhere in the world. It won't draw a lot of attention to itself, but it also doesn't have anything to do with the space that it's in, kind of a cookie cutter style, a little bit of the triumph of corporate architecture in the international style. We jump ahead in time to the 1980s. Take a look at the next building down the river. Now we see that reflective glass on the surface showing off the neighbors. We're not just thinking about ourselves in the building anymore. We're starting to think about the space around us. The color of the glass very similar to the color of the river. As the river curves, the building curves along with it, trying to look good in context. That contextualism starting in the 1980s. So to review, we started off with cathedrals in the early 1920s, Art Deco into the Roaring 20s, we got a blip in the 30s and 40s, then black boxes, white boxes, and we're out of the box with contextualism in the 80s. That's our time machine of architecture, all those styles, all on display right here. Another good example, remember we talked about those positive loops? Another good example of a positive loop, we've got a building here with a bakery and a fitness center. Nice little positive loop there. Go to one, go to the other. This building here on the left, we used to not talk about until they added this artwork on the side. Can you figure out what we're looking at here? See that Y shape up at the top? Remember Wolf Point, right? It's the river. The orange brick that you see on the side of the building, that's this building. It's a "You Are Here" map. Very helpful for out-of-towners. Anyone gets lost, jump in the river, swim over, figure out where you are.